Jockeys. I'm Stanley Kubrick, the film director.
Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Back to the Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Neal, and today I'm going to talk about a movie almost no one knows about.
The trouble with Marlon is he thinks he's Brando.
But let's get one thing straight before we continue.
I seem to have run out of vodka.
John Malkovich
I'm Stanley Kubrick.
I'm Stanley Kubrick.
I am Stanley Kubrick.
is
Stanley Kubrick.
Stanley Kubrick.
Stanley Kubrick.
not
Stanley Kubrick.
Stanley Kubrick.
Stanley Kubrick.
Stanley Kubrick.
And I have shaved off my beard off.
But for all anyone knew in the second half of the 20th century, he could have looked like him. Because almost no one knew what Stanley Kubrick looked like. He was famous for it, or maybe infamous is closer to the mark. Regardless, the general movie-going public was largely convinced he was an obsessive, reclusive, and possibly sociopathic filmmaking genius. Most people were like, get a load of this loon.
One of his pictures are equivalent to 10 of somebody else's.
I love him 1 minute, and the next minute I hate him. I could kill him.
Perhaps the most intelligent person I've ever met.
Everybody pretty much acknowledges he's the man.
And there is still a part of Stanley that's a great mystery to me.
I still feel that underrates him.
Tell me, Mr. Kubrick.
Kubrick.
By 1998, I was already a proper high school movie nerd, and even I probably barely knew what he looked like because we didn't have the internet as we all know it today. And there were rumors he had been planning an erotic magnum opus for a couple of years. Then came the announcement that Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise had signed to a limitless shooting contract. They essentially agreed to shoot the movie for as long as Stanley Kubrick wanted to shoot the movie. But in 1998, in the middle of production, he pre-recorded an acceptance speech for the Directors Guild of America D.W. Griffith Award, which was later aired.
I'm sorry not to be able to be with you tonight to receive this great honor of the D.W. Griffith Award. But I'm in London making Eyes Wide Shut with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman.
That is actually Stanley Kubrick, age 70. At that point in his career, he had released a dozen feature-length films, including Paths of Glory, Spartacus, Dr. Strangelove, 2001, A Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon, The Shining, and Full Metal Jacket, none of which I was old enough to see in the theater. His last movie had come out over 10 years earlier.
I'm not Stanley Kubrick, I'm Alan Conway! Alan Conway, one of life's great failures!
The speculation for what was talked about as the ultimate erotic movie starring one of the most famous couples on the planet made it one of the most talked about movies in the world. It was all terribly intriguing, but I still didn't know what he really looked or sounded like until that acceptance speech.
Just about this time, I'm probably in the car on the way to the studio, which, as it happens, reminds me of a conversation I had with Steven Spielberg about what was the most difficult and challenging thing about directing a film. He thought the most difficult and challenging thing about directing a film was getting out of the car.
To the sort of great unwashed, he was a sort of mystical figure who didn't travel, who didn't take airplanes, who worked in secrecy, who just wasn't seen.
A lot of people in those days didn't know what Stanley looked like.
And it was these two factors, his reputation and his anonymity, that allowed a small-time grifter to enter the scene.
Stanley, please.
Stanley hated being called Stan.
So, what film are you working on now, Stan?
That would have really annoyed him.
It is a science fiction, comedy, drama, love affair, caper movie set in the future.
Sounds great. What's it called?
All-night prescriptions.
Wacky title.
What Stanley and I did do, we often used to come up with titles for films that we thought should be made. Only ministers of the Third Reich can use green ink. Stanley thought was a wonderful title. Leg Candy was another good title. Coffin Not Included. Stanley thought Sharp Shadow was a good title. Roof Goo was another one. And Stanley said, "What's that?" And the guy said, "Roof Goo."
All-night prescriptions. So, who have you got in it, Stan?
No, Stanley, please.
And I loved it in the picture, putting that in, because, you know, if he'd have been watching it, he'd have really hated that.
Always refer to me as Stanley.
Color Me Kubrick is based on the true story of a man named Alan Conway.
He's not Alan Conway.
Who in the early 90s began impersonating Stanley Kubrick to perpetrate various illegal scams.
And got away with some rather astonishing feats, if you will.
Usually for food, booze, transportation, or sex.
so much more relaxed now.
This is an actual case of art imitating life, imitating art, imitating life, imitating art. The funny thing here is the guy knew almost nothing about Stanley Kubrick, nor did he ever bother to find out. In fact, they didn't even find out about him until one of Conway's victims wrote Kubrick's assistant a letter.
Mr. Kubrick,
This is the writer of the letter, not Stanley's assistant.
I would like to alert you to an imposter who uses your name, Stanley Kubrick, as a cover for his wicked actions. His real name is Alan Conway. I first met him in Marseille last year when I was working as a rent boy. Conway wrecks people's lives and has no moral conscience.
Rock is the single most treacherous area for the showbiz entrepreneur. As a matter of fact, while I was in LA, I had to sort out some rather sticky problems for Bruce. What, Bruce?
When Scuttlebutt got back to Stanley that a low-rent doppelganger was running around London trading his name for brandy, he asked his assistant to look into it further.
And I produced a big file, an ongoing file for Stanley about, what he was doing, what he was up to.
Suddenly, people started coming out of the woodwork, claiming to have met and been swindled by Stanley Kubrick. There were daily briefings on the situation as it evolved. The movie kept shooting, of course. It was the longest continual movie shoot in history.
And Stanley was not restricted by time. He refused to be. And that is a great luxury that only somebody like he could afford.
It was obvious to us that this guy was going around, pretty full time, pretending to be Stanley.
He just would run into people, and it's usually people he wanted to sleep with or got some free cigarettes out of or some money or got to stay in a hotel or...
You're never to pay for anything ever again when you come in. The drinks, the food, everything's on the house from now on.
So when Conway introduced himself as Kubrick, the intended target's critical thinking skills went out of the window and he could lean into the scam.
And he just walked all over them and abused them. It was like, from his point of view, like, taking candy from a child.
But if you're going to be someone no one's really much seen, and many people are quite intimidated by the mystico, well, it's pretty smart.
I thought it was amusing that he could get away with it. It was just staggering to me that he could actually go around London and people believe this.
I like him. I do like him. I think he's hilarious, to be honest with you. I'm not too sure if he is actually Stan Kubrick.
Yeah, these are some of his favourite films. Impulse, Missing in Action 2.
We have here Conway's motto, always be sincere,
Whether you mean it or not.
And John created a much more outgoing character.
He was clearly a sort of incredible fantasist.
Of course. Look, Marlowe Greenbaum at the Sands Hotel. He's an old school chum of mine. We go way back. This is the person to handle this. You know people like that. It's not what you know, but who you know, right?
You could be bigger than Elvis.
Bigger than Jesus, lad.
Can you imagine how big Jesus would be if only he played the guitar?
I'd like you to meet Stanley Kubrick. And I went up to Alan Conway and I said, hi, I'm Jim Davidson. And he said, the comedian, right? He instantly got me on the hook. That was it. I bought him lunch and listened to his bull.
3001 will do for 2001 what 2001 did for when that was.
John is playing Alan Conway rather better than Alan Conway played Alan Conway.
I don't have anything to say about acting, and if I did, I'd ask a question. That is a double helping of coq au vin, isn't it?
Yes, it is, sir.
And my bottle of vodka.
Now, let's be clear at this point that John Malkovich absolutely makes this movie.
I ordered a carton of 200 cigarettes. Where might they be?
I'll fetch them for you right away, sir.
It's the Malkovich show.
Once upon a time, I was directing a film called Spartacus, and there was a very young Miss Kirk Douglas playing the title role.
He's unhinged.
And one day, the waiter forgot to bring Miss Kirk Douglas her cigarettes, and Miss Douglas, being the that she is, fired him!
It's magnificent, but I cannot talk about his performance without mentioning the accents.
When they were talking to him sort of about how he did this scam, but he had a sort of brilliant American accent, which he employed which then he did a couple of lines of, and he sounded exactly what he sounded like normally, which is a travel agent from Harrow.
No, Stanley, please. You know, that mister puts years on me.
Just from that, I took the idea about someone just very happily doing bad accents and no one saying anything.
Show me the way to the salle privé.
Excellent. His accent changes from take to take, and when he said, "I'm really titched."
Oh, Jesper, I'm so titched. Oh. Do you have the receipt?
When this came out in 2005, I remember thinking, who directed this? And bravo for letting Malkovich completely off the lead. When I looked into it further, my enthusiasm just grew. It was directed by Kubrick's longtime assistant director, Brian Cook, who was actually there shooting Eyes Wide Shut with everyone.
You certainly have had a lot of directors talk to me, and you just wish they'd lost the power of speech somewhere, because most of them don't know anything about acting, or even many of them filmmaking for that matter, so.
After a certain amount of experience, your only reasonable expectation is that the director does not try to actively you up.
We got any nice coffee in here, I wonder? Acceptable end frame. Stanley would have wanted it just a fraction more. No, on the side, just a touch from the right. But it was perfect. I loved it. Stanley would have had this. This would have been a 2-day job with Stanley. This shot, a week to light and a week to shoot with Stanley. This shot. I like Stanley a lot. He's very amusing. Stanley would be one of your top 12 for dinner if you had to choose a dinner table, because on his own he was a tremendous raconteur and very, very dry sense of humour, particularly about people in the film industry. He had a tremendous feeling about them all, and very dry and funny and very witty. He would love the fact that Tony and I went out there and had a bit of fun with it, and I think he would enjoy it. I think he would think it was pretty good. He'd think we shot it quickly.
What would Stanley have said about this film? I think he would...
Who is the first person there to greet me? It's Alan Conway!
I think Stanley Kubrick would sit there, probably in complete silence like this, and be really amused by it.
I've come to see my latest film.
Have they given you an appointment yet?
I think he'd enjoy it. I mean, he'd be astonished that anybody can shoot a picture in 8 weeks, because that's one thing that Kubrick couldn't do, of course.
I discovered this movie when it came out in 2005, and I've yet to have someone tell me they've already seen it. What I've always loved about it is that some of Kubrick's gang got together to make a funny movie about their old boss, someone I have spent an inordinate amount of time studying. Now that we've arrived at the 25th anniversary of Stanley Kubrick's death, maybe someone will dust off the film print of this and scan it into a computer so that other people can watch it without having to borrow my copy.
I'm Alan Conway now. Sad. Sad. But I enjoyed being Kubrick. Great part for anybody to ever have.
I've been talking over old creative differences with Marlon Brando, and he's such a